I was told to give a curator talk, and I was only told that I was a curator about 2 weeks before the exhibit opened. So I sort of thought I was the dude who was putting things together and sort of saying where things should hang on the wall, and apparently that is the definition of a curator, so that's pretty sweet. I now have another job title that'll just rake in future dollars somehow along the line. So I'm not an art historian, and I'm not a comics scholar, so there are probably people who would be better suited to talk about particular aspects of Paul's work in terms of putting it into the larger context of comics history, and there'll probably be people who are better suited in talking about his use of form and his use of shadow and cross-hatching and all the sort of technical artistry things, but that's not really what I do. I'm a folklorist, which is a peculiar occupation at best. It seems awfully old-fashioned, because we have this tendency of considering it the things that the folk do in their glens and their dales, and when they are unlettered types doing some fanciful, miraculous, and ultimately not particularly civilized things. But a folklorist is really interested in expressive culture, and particularly expressive culture that it doesn't get promulgated through institutions, through universities, through conservatories, and often isn't necessarily part of the popular culture, at least in terms of stuff that is cross-mediated. It's about the small group. It's about, one of the classic definitions is artistic communication in small groups. My interest is when folklore or folkloric productions start to sort of seep into something slightly larger. So I'm interested in basically what happens when we take objects of folk culture and turn them into something that is meant to satisfy, for lack of a better word, popular culture. Markets might be one way of looking at it, but certainly it's meant to resonate with an audience that is slightly larger than that immediate, intimate, small group setting. And so this is one of the things that intrigued me about Paul's work. Paul MacKinnon, if you don't know, was born in 1949, 2 days away from being a child of the 50s. December 30th is, I think, his birth date. Am I correct in that? I remember things. And in Sydney Mines. And he had always been interested in art, always been interested in humor as well. If you go through the yearbooks, his high school yearbooks, which are all available coincidentally at the Sydney Mines Library, you can see the illustrations that he did, both somber ones for Remembrance Day and for memorializing miners, and also very witty ones. He would do those, we've all had yearbooks, that first page when here's what the faculty do, and then here's the graduating class. He would do those illustrations. And he'd also contribute some humorous pieces, including, finally upon graduation, he wrote the humorous essay of what happens to all the class of 69, 20 years hence. And the more sober essay was written by one of the more sober students, who ironically happens to be Alan Fraser. So the two, the yin and the yang. What's that?
What's the irony?
Oh, a solid citizen is responsible for generating that text. So, and enough about that. So Paul had been interested in art. After high school, he went to NASCAD, and then student loans came in, and he realized I can drink and go travel, which is what we all do when our student loans come in the very first time. So NASCAD wasn't long on his horizon. He went to Ontario, and he came back to Sydney and traveled back and forth, and eventually he was working in Sydney in the early 1970s. On what was that grant called? I want to call it the LIE, but I might have that abbreviation correct. What's that? LIP, L-I-P, right? It was basically it was sort of an equivalent of Young Canada Works. It was a community-involved government grants that allowed people to, certainly in economically disenfranchised areas like post-1967 Cape Breton and the beginnings of the industrial decline. And he was working, teaching art to elementary school students. But he wanted to take it seriously. But the other thing he was doing, of course, was he had friends. He had a community that some were new to him, some were people that he went to high school with, and they formed this sort of core of common interest, which involved hanging out in bars, which involved drinking, which involved, as we do in our early 20s, tackling the issues of the day and solving problems and then forgetting them in a drunken haze. So it's kind of a glorious time. And he was always quiet. He was a quieter person than I might be suggesting at this time. But he always drew and he always wrote. And one of the things, I'll take you back into the back room where we have some of the notebooks from that time. But he always carried his notebook with him, and he was always sketching, sometimes in sort of fine art sketches, and most of the time in his comic, it's inappropriate to call them doodling, but his comic sketches. And he would ethnographically capture some of the people of his time, and he would also write adventures for them. So he was becoming a comics artist by accident more than anything, and he had written a couple of stories. If you look at the iPads, and you can feel free to look at them, there's a couple of complete comic stories. Two that were all based on characters that all based on his friends. One is basically taking the Robin Hood story and doing something with it, and one is based on Peter Pan. And they're fully fledged. They were circulated in these notebooks, literally circulated. People would borrow them and pass them from person to person. Eventually, they landed in the recently deceased Danny McIntyre has been the caretaker of those notebooks for the past 30 years. But that's just where they ended up. So he wanted to take this one step seriously. He wanted to be a professional graphics artist, and he took the design course at Holland College in PEI. And for that program, one of the things they had to do was take a project from conception to completion, and what he decided to do was actually do a comic book. And so again, he had his notebooks as reference, and he had photographs of all his friends as visual reference, but again, I'm interested in what happens. My general program of research is interested in what happens when you take this communication that's between friends, between people who have enough of a common experience that explanation is superfluous. Common sense might be one way of looking at it. And moving beyond it. What happens when that audience is someone who you might share a common cause with, but you're not necessarily known to them. And that's the problem that he needed to do. He couldn't base an entire comic book and find a market for it, based entirely on the drugged and drunken exploits of his friends and their various sexual peccadillos. It just wouldn't necessarily find purchase. So one of the things he did, so you can start walking because there's a couple of things we could be discussing. One of the things he did was try and infuse these characters with, create something that was going to be still relevant to his friends and relevant to to a potential new audience. So in late 1973, there was a meeting of the Cape Breton Municipalities Board, and the president of that board, I want to say his name was Dan Monroe, but I'm working from memory. He was the mayor of Glace Bay at the time, and he suggested that we should circulate a petition for Cape Breton to be its own province. Cape Breton had, as we all know from our high school history, Cape Breton had momentarily been its own, not quite province, its independent state of some description. 1780, help me with the date, 1786, 1780s? What, 17 when? 1790. Okay, we know those dates. They are emblazoned. So, where the thing that was once called Nova Scotia was split into a number of pieces, particularly New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton Island. Each was expected to, start a legislature and have representative government. Something happened, a topic of long debate, which we perhaps will not enter into right now, and in 1820, this independence was taken from Cape Breton and it became back to the part of the province of Nova Scotia, answering to those fat cats in Halifax. Discuss amongst yourselves. Let's move on. So there's always been a hint, just a soupçon, a suggestion of that there had been some kind of misappropriation at that time. Cape Breton independence had been a theme for a number of years, but in 1973, Dan Monroe suggested we should be our own province. And it was met with a mixed reaction at best. Some people adamantly supported the idea. Some people thought it was preposterous and foolish. And it was one of those things that happens at this time of year when, the legislature has basically closed down and the news stories are being what they were. It blew up in the letters to the editor and various opinion columns, and then basically subsided once the Christmas sales really took off. One of the things that was mentioned by the Premier actually at Sydney River in when he was doing a mock parliament and chairing a mock parliament at, sorry, not Sydney River, at Sydney Academy, and he was asked about Cape Breton independence. He said that the idea probably would not be feasible on any real level. However, it was warranted by genuine feelings and perhaps genuine history of mismanagement and marginalization by Halifax. One of the things that came out of that discussion was a cartoon by Bob Chambers, who had this, he's the editorial cartoonist for the Chronicle Herald. He has this wonderful cartoon. It's printed in the book, which is available from Cape Breton University Press. Only $20 today, I imagine. Taxes in. And it involved a group wearing kilts and miners' helmets and carrying rifles at the causeway. The causeway has been covered with rubble and coils of barbed wire and signs saying the last line of defense from the Nova Scotian invasion and so forth. And then one of these beleaguered warriors turns to another and says, "Do you ever have the feeling that nobody really cares?" And that seemed to crystallize something, at least in Paul's mind. This is, of course, 1973. It's the same year as the Symbionese Liberation Army and Patty Hearst. It was the same year as Palestine Liberation Organization was recognized by the UN. This was the time of independence. It was only a couple of, and independent terrorist movements, for lack of a better word. It was only a couple of years after after the FLQ and the October Crisis. So the idea of Cape Breton independence was, on one hand, seen as potentially unfeasible, but on the other hand, very desirable. So Paul, instead of trying to turn these characters, and he introduced these characters into the second story in his issue, the ones based on Peter Pan and the one based on Robin Hood. Instead of doing that, he created the idea of the Cape Breton Liberation Army. What would Cape Bretoners actually rebel? What would a Cape Breton rebellion look like? And ultimately, what would be their end goal apart from independence? And so he produced the first issue, which is around this corner. See, it's a curator walk and talk this way. Excuse me. How many of you are there? There we go. Hey, how's it going? And we're good. One or two more? They're lollygaggers. So the Cape Breton Liberation Army, what would you do if you were part of a liberation front in Cape Breton, and what would you be fighting for? Well, he basically determined that the true Cape Bretoner really wanted nothing more than the freedom to hang out in taverns, listen to blues music, drink as much beer as possible, and hopefully be surrounded by scantily clad women while doing so. And I think on one level, we can admire that as a goal. On another level, we can take a step back and say, ha ha ha, of course there are realities that need to be addressed as well. But he's creating a comic universe. It doesn't necessarily need to be a sustained political argument. He was not creating a polemic, and he never considered himself political. He was trying to do something that he would find amusing. So the idea of an army that was hell-bent on creating a world that was safe and free for Cape Bretoners to hang out in taverns and drink beer and listen to blues music and hang around scantily clad women all the time, was certainly enough to sustain a comic argument. So he had the first issue. We have here, I won't go through each and every scene, but we have a classic comic book front page, basically a splash indicating what the primary pièce de résistance of the story would be, and that is General Peyton, based on his friend Peyton Chisholm, who had appeared, of course, in the other books as well, standing atop the Seal Island Bridge, facing down the Halifax Hard Hats, a mercenary squad sent by the Premier to finally crush the Cape Breton Liberation Army and all their rebellious needs. The story starts off in a simple tavern where they are doing nothing else but playing pool, when lo and behold they are ambushed by the reserve army. Well, that doesn't cause much, it doesn't take much for them to immediately crack into their fighting form. Pool cues go a-flying, shirts go a-ripped, punches go a-going, and he's able to take down the two of them are able to take down the entire reserve army more or less single-handedly, specifically chastising them for spilling their beers. They manage to escape to their hideout, much to Premier Regan's chagrin. Meanwhile, the North End Raggetts, a motorcycle gang of hoodlums, continues the fight, just beating the tar out of the reserve army. After a quick aside from Huey and Alan, they meet at their headquarters, which is the old Martello Tower up in Sydney Mines, covered in graffiti, which he was able to cover with the names of his friends, just as little shout-outs and hellos to people, where they would meet and plan to go to PEI with one more mission. Well, what missions did they typically go on? All they really did was liberate liberate beer trucks and liberate taverns. They had one more beer truck to liberate before they went. But what else would one do? Oh no, it's an ambush by the aforementioned Halifax Hardhats who we met on the cover. But far too clever and far too tough. The Halifax Hardhats are no match for General Peyton and his cohort. He's able to, again, beat the tar out of them with classic Kirby Dot psychedelic illustrations in the background. He goes to the Seal Island Bridge on motorbike. He leaps off in a set of, on a hang glider. Lo and behold, here goes for Cape Breton and the Liberation Army. A small step for mankind, a giant step for Cape Breton. He lands on his friend Admiral Stu Squires' boat. Stu Squires was a fisherman, and to this day is a fisherman on the Brodie Lakes. And they go to Prince Edward Island and hang out at the tavern in Charlottetown, at the Charlottetown Hotel, which is one of the few places you could drink in PEI, and of course the college where Paul was at the same time. You can actually go online and see pictures in the archive of the Canadian National Railway, and you will see these exact same chairs. Apparently it was a lovely place to drink, in addition to being the only place to drink. So the group has reconvened and met in their safely away from the persecution of Cape Breton, and the story basically ends there and transforms into a slightly more psychedelic, drug-induced tale involving Peter Pond and involving Captain Glow, the characters who he's introduced before. But really, if you look at this story as year one of this idea of a people fighting for Cape Breton and some form of questionable end goal at best. So he produced this issue. He produced about 100 copies of it. It was met with a lot of applause, and people seemed to like it, and immediately asked him what he was going to do for his second issue. And fortunately for him, and unfortunately for the trees of the northern part of the island, the spruce budworm started to affect, another flare-up of the spruce budworm. This would actually be the same story that a year or two after the production of issue 2 would involve the concerns about spraying that gave rise to the environmental movement, that gave rise to Elizabeth May and her first public forays into activism and politics. In the meantime, the bugs were starting to infect the forest. But not just any bugs, according to Paul. And if you see on this wall, you start to see his plans for issue 2. Yes, there was certainly an infection by the spruce budworm, but there were a couple who, of course, flying in from the mainland, which is not an accident. This is an infestation from the mainland. They flew through the toxic smoke that is Port Hawkesbury, Port Hastings, through the effluents of the heavy water plant, through the pulp mill, and through the generating station. And 6 of these moths, despite regular history of what happens to the spruce budworm, 6 became giant, enormous, like straight out of Dune, massive spruce budworms. And they started to affect where else but the Wreck Cove construction site. Wreck Cove was a generating station that was being built at that time. Fairly controversial. As a project, it actually went ahead reasonably smoothly with few labor disruptions. There were some issues about having to rezone parts of the Highlands National Park in order to accommodate it, which was met with a certain amount of opprobrium. But the construction workers, they were very concerned because eventually their bar and strip club and massage parlor was being eaten by the spruce budworm. So someone needed to put a stop to this. And once again, Gerald Regan got on the phone. Reluctantly, who would you call in a pinch in Cape Breton? You would call its greatest hero. You would call General Peyton. So, high atop Cobbett House, where Kentco, Paul's doppelganger for Devco, was located and housed. He sends a summons for no one else but General Peyton. Peyton goes, and again, when a Cape Bretoner takes a job, their first consideration is, will this get me enough hours so I can go on Pogie? He does the math in his head, and he quickly realizes that that is indeed the case. And so, using his brute strength and his brutality and his sword, he becomes Peyton the Semi-Barbarian, and he is able to, with the help of a couple of miners, we've skipped ahead in the story because there's only so many we can put on the wall, with the help of a couple of friends of the King Coleman family from Glace Bay, Old King Coleman and Nat King Coleman, they are able to finally defeat the spruce budworms through a mix of dropping a coal scuttle on their heads. She is Cape Breton's top lady boxer, and then just brute strength. And lo and behold, they are able to celebrate for a big free-for-all at the Miners' Forum in Glace Bay. Where else would you celebrate these sorts of things? So the idea of being terrorized, in a classic science fiction trope, the idea of something being a result of environmental contagion, monstrosity. It's not too different from the Godzilla stories. It's not too different from a whole host of other science fiction themes. But when it happens in Cape Breton, who is going to defend it? It's someone who is both brave, pure of heart, and really interested in getting EI. So again, it tapped into one of the things about the first and the second issue, and ultimately the entire corpus taps into, is this conception, this playful, you okay with the pen? You good? All right. This playful conception of how the Cape Bretoner understands themselves in terms of, on one hand, as industrious, as capable as anyone else. On the other hand, in their ludic life, when they understand themselves in a playful kind of fashion, being much more interested in Pogie, being much more interested in drinking, being much more interested in sort of being the happy-go-lucky maritimer, for whom EI, or I guess UI at the time, is not a stigma, it is just a fact of life. So even though he's never political, he is playing with this new reality in a way that found a certain purchase and gave it just an undertone of, cynicism isn't quite the right word, but an undertone of harshness. You might see that maybe issue 2 is a slight exception, but none of this is taking place in the kind of romanticized Cape Breton that had already been part of the tourist economy. None of this is really taking place in the villages or the fishing ports, or there's nary a fiddle to be seen until issue 3. This is an urban Cape Breton. This is an industrial Cape Breton. This is Cape Breton with, in terms of vernacular architecture, most of the things that he experiences are temporary buildings that have seemingly become now part of the permanent landscape. Aluminum siding, square, almost Quonset hut type buildings where the taverns start to emerge. So this is not a romantic, lush Cape Breton. This is a very real, urban, hard Cape Breton, in which joy can nevertheless be had. So after the second issue, he turned to the third great issue of Cape Bretoners, and that was East Coast blues music. Again, very few fiddles, although Marcel Doucet does make a couple of appearances. And he starts off with another classic science fiction trope, the frozen caveman. Another one of his friends, a new friend to be introduced, Lucifer Blood, who was actually George Henderson. He was called by some Cape Breton's first hippie, and he seemingly had been frozen in the middle of a giant snail hunt off the coast of Newfoundland about 100,000 years BC. And he was revived and becomes, what else, a roadie for Matt Minglewood. And as doing so, he rarely, if ever, speaks throughout the entire run, save for a couple of romantic grunts. And as he's at the Tradewinds Tavern in North Sydney, which was torn down in '76 in order to construct the expanded parking lot of the ferry terminal, a show is being set up. All the denizens are in their glorious repose, and he hears a sound. Again, for the purposes of the exhibit, we have actually cut out a large. Issue 3 had a number of intertwining stories that all met. After this, we find out a little bit more about Dr. Potato, who is this character based on his friend Jack Matthews, who's a bit of a wheeler dealer. And then we find out what has happened to the Cape Breton Liberation Army. They have yet another plan. This time, it isn't hijacking a beer truck. They need a fundraiser, and they discount cellophane suppers. They discount having a big night of Tarbish, and instead they decide to kidnap an OPEC minister who's going to be visiting Port Hawkesbury. Well, that backfires because that, yet again, was a trap set by the mainlanders. The OPEC minister is actually Fred Tomey. Is it Tomey or Tommy? Tommy. I hear different pronunciations. Tommy, Fred Tomey. So Fred Tomey is, he was the owner and proprietor of the Whitney Pier Athletic Association, Athletic Club, and which was one of the ground zeros of East Coast music, and it appears later on in one of the calendars. Of Lebanese descent, never quite lost his accent, and so the association with an OPEC minister just works quite well for Paul's intent. Tom Kent and the premier send Earl Turbot, who was the mayor at the time. I don't know how many of you know the history of mayors in Cape Breton in the 1970s, but Earl Turbot had been a professor at Little X, and on his 29th birthday was when he was actually sworn in as mayor, the youngest mayor in Sydney's history, and he was known as a little bit of a dandy. He liked the mayor's medal. You know, that chain of office? He really liked it, and with a combination of wide lapel suits that were en vogue and slightly feathered hair, it was a sight. So Commander Sidney flies a spaceship, which you can just see in silhouette there, which is the just freshly constructed City Hall. The history of which I won't bore you with right now, but had just been opened and was Earl Turbot's great contribution to Sydney. And they managed to land managed to infiltrate the headquarters in Sydney Mines, the same Martello Tower, and as they escape, one of them escapes through a back channel and enters into the basement of this tavern, and then the story reconvenes and finishes up on this wall. The exhibit was laid out not necessarily with the intention of bringing 20 people through a narrow gap all at once, so forgive that. So on this wall, you just see the very end of this story where Nat King Coleman, who had been the decoy, lures the soldiers out and Commander Sidney. A great melee breaks out because what else do you do when you're in a tavern? The Cape Bretoners rise up and, using beer bottles and all kinds of fisticuffs, defeat soundly the mercenaries that were sent from the mainland and from Sydney. We have a brief incursion about encouraging people to move out west to Alberta ever so briefly and discover the wonder that is marijuana, and a great party breaks out with a band, a supergroup of the time, basically the lineups of both Sam Moon's band and the Minglewood band at the time. And he introduces a couple of other friends just to say hello. So East Coast blues is something that he's going to be concerned with his entire life, especially when it comes to retrospect. After issue 3, there were a couple of efforts at creating a 4th issue, and we have those in the back, and I'll invite you to look at them later. And a 5th issue, I think probably, I haven't been able to date it, but seems to be either the late 80s or the early 90s. But fundamentally, the idea of being able to be a full-time illustrator in Cape Breton didn't necessarily prove feasible, and he went back to school eventually to become a nurse. But one of the things that he did do was he started creating these wall calendars. Every year, with a couple of exceptions, from 1979 to 2000, he produced the Cape Breton Liberation Army calendar. We start off in 79 at the long row, the back there. They're interesting individually. They continue the lives of these characters, and they continue many of the themes. One of them, the thing about reading them all at once, as opposed to having them doled out year after year, is that you now get to see these people age. Issues 1, 2, and 3 were basically all from that same halcyon era of hanging out in taverns and wishing that scantily clad women would hang around you, where unemployment was almost romantic, where the putting together a life that was based on contracts and temporary work and contingent work was almost fun because you were in your mid-20s and you still had all your friends. And one of the themes that at least I read into it, and I don't think I'm wrong, or at least I don't think I'm ill-advised for thinking such, is that as you go through the calendars, the early ones, it's still very much about youth and drinking, and you start to have this shift. In this calendar, which is from 1987, it's about having to leave Cape Breton and forcing to go to the mainland, crossing the Canso Causeway, and again, rooted in that song, similar to Causeway Crossing, it was built for going away. This idea that people are eventually being expelled, and again, economically expelled. And again, he fills it with his friends, but they're not necessarily in the same celebratory mood that they might have been presented in earlier. You have, in the 1990 calendar, you have professional Cape Bretons associated with PCBs and the toxic landfill of Sydney tar ponds, and people who had managed to make careers as archetypes, as it were, of Cape Bretoners. So you have Bette McDonald, you have Mr. Max and Cecil, you have John Cabot-Trail, who's a whole other story when it comes to Paul and his work, and you have Huey and Alan. And then you have, in the 93 calendar, and there are others, but these are just representative, you have the passing of time, and you have some of his people who were both his influences, but also his friends, like Enver Sampson, like Diego Gunn, like Marcel Doucet, who had all passed away, as well as Fred Tomey. This is the fairly conspicuous floor of the Whitney Pier Athletic Club, and the demise of the railway. So this is basically about retrospect and things that were no longer present. Other issues in terms of amalgamation and video lotto terminals, but I want to focus on this one ever so briefly, because this is kind of the culmination of his argument about East Coast music, and that what you had represented in issue 3 was a vibrant culture that, yes, wasn't necessarily entirely born in Cape Breton, but was influenced by Chicago blues, was interested in Texas blues, but spoke to a Cape Breton reality, as blues music tends to do. It emerges in post-industrial cultures, and it's popular among the disenfranchised. So the association of a music that is typically African American, but influenced with a maritime style and influenced with maritime instrumentation. The use of brass is particular to East Coast. Made it a very rich and intriguing cultural product. And then this is the calendar where he talks about the Monster Max and the idea that because of the interest and because of the government support in Gaelic and Celtic music and the revival, you started to have anyone picking up a fiddle, anyone branding themselves as part of this revival. And the question remains, well, what actually happens to the music that meant so much to me in my 20s and 30s? Matt Minglewood and Sam Moon are having difficulty finding gigs. Bars aren't interested necessarily in hosting them because there's more money to be had within Celtic music. So again, there's a wistfulness that comes in that maybe, and I'd be interested in hearing from people, maybe when they appeared once a year on your wall, just about this time of year or as Christmas presents, the retrospect and the new characters and just checking to see whether you are included, whether you've been part of his sort of Where's Waldo-esque experiments and cramming as many people as he can into a picture, might have been sort of a joyful occurrence. But reading them all at once in the same time it takes to read one of those issues, and this encapsulates a man going from 30 to 50 as opposed to some halcyon days in his mid-20s. It just brings a different and a different tone that it never approaches cynicism, but it approaches something close to resignation. He ends at 2000. He ends with actually a fairly joyful calendar as the Cape Breton Liberation Army are no longer necessarily becoming parents, but now becoming grandparents, and about recruiting the next generation. And so that was basically his last production of the CBLA. I'm not going to talk too much longer because there are other little things that might be better served just discovering yourself. In the back room, as I said, there are the notebooks. The original notebooks opened a couple of pages. We might be able to open up the case and you could leaf through them if you are careful and have washed your hands recently. There are some examples of his process in terms of creating the '96 calendar, and there are some examples of his efforts at a 4th and a 5th issue.